Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Prince, and I'm your host for the MRMIA broadcast. And today we have another video in our series of introducing the board members of the MRMIA team. Today we have Tom Dahlin, who's joining us as the head of model risk at Centennial Bank with over 20 years of experience in the banking industry. He's actually working on a white paper to right size the SR 11.7 guidance for smaller banks, as well as talk to us about the Mermian organization. So, Tom, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, Mark. Pleasure to be here today. So, as you indicated, my name is Tom Dahlin. I've been in banking for a number of years across risk, largely in the quantification space. So, I have been working with models on various sides of the table, whether it was building models, using models, explaining models, defending models. So over the course of 20 plus years, largely in the banking space, we've given witness to how models are being built, how they are deployed, and most recently, the use of models has become so intensified given the advent of Basel, of stress testing, of capital stress testing. There is greater scrutiny on the discipline of model risk. Although we have been given guidance, it is a profession and an area that continues to refine itself and try to present ourselves as an emerging practice, not only in banking but across many industries as it relates to the soundness of models and the use of models. So, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, no problem. So let's begin kind of where SR 11.7 itself begins, which is the definition of a model. When reading through the SR 11.7 document, that definition of a model is very important because it defines the scope of what these small banks, these small model risk managers should look at in terms of defining their model inventory. So how are you taking that definition and right sizing it for smaller banks?
So the question about what is a model is provided to us in 11.7. That said, it is ambiguous. It is intentionally ambiguous. It's written in the construct of any quantification system that has an ability of prediction. It's important to the bank. So that opens up a pretty wide area in terms of what is a model. Now, in a traditional sense, those folks that studied the development of models, we would typically think it's anything that's statistical in nature, regression models. That would be our immediate conclusion that that is indeed a model. However, as we enter into discussions with the regulators, it's not limited to that. It is also those items that are important to the bank, earmarks, important to the bank. So even though you may have a system that could be as simple as an average, if there is predictive powers to it, such even I'm taking an average of what happened in the last 3 years, and if it is important to the bank, whether it be reserves or pricing, what have you, that then qualifies it as being a model. Now, as this becomes a model, the importance of that is we are required to ensure that we collect a model and we treat it as such. Mm-hmm. Now, the more important aspect is, well, we will treat these differently from a risk perspective. So the more important, the more complex, will get its highest level of a validation, the highest degree of scrutiny. Now, there are many different ways that we can look at a model and say, well, how should we classify these?
Yeah.
What we typically do is we try to take a very pragmatic approach to this. And when we say what is riskiness of a model, we tend to look at the materiality of it and the complexity. Now, the complexity of it can be anywhere from what do we think is a simple average to the more complex AI machine learning type. So that could then dictate what is the complexity of a model. And materiality is the impact to a bank.
Right. So let's, this kind of, I'm getting a lot of that. We're gonna pause here for a second. Okay, so that's very interesting, Tom, that you're talking about materiality and complexity when trying to classify models. So it's not just about trying to identify a method. These things could be spreadsheets, could be advanced AI machine learning models or vendor models. And one of the things I'd like to talk about next is how you prioritize how you should pay attention to the models in your inventory. I know you started talking about risk sharing with but are there other ways that the model risk manager should be thinking about assessing risk in their inventory and profiling these models so that they can better figure out where they should focus their energy and efforts?
Right. So we talked about materiality and complexity of a model will drive our risk tiering. Now that's a requirement because we want to be able to separate and segment the entire inventory. Now the reason why we want to create the separation is for a couple of reasons. One, the question is always asked about your most risky models in the bank and how are you treating them? What is the periodicity of the reviews? So that becomes almost an important focus of the program for model risk. Now, the types of models that will tend to be in that category will be the models like your ALM models, your BSA models for money laundering, your fraud models, your pricing models. Those will tend to be your higher risk models. Those will tend to use more complex statistical techniques. Those will be the models that will use either machine learning, higher order statistical types of models. Mm-hmm. Alternatively, you have these other models. These are more operational in nature. These will be loan approval models, loan decisioning types of models. Those types of models quite often tend to be vendor models. Now, most of your vendor models are quite prominent in the smaller banks. So the way we treat these will follow the same approach in the sense that we still need to look at the model development, we still need to look at implementation and data and so forth. However, we want to be able to look at the tier one models with a greater level of intensity and more often. So tiers 1, 2, and 3s, the timing of the validations become further apart. So as you get to a tier 3 model, this tends to be, this could be a spreadsheet model, something very simple, but you still want to be able to look at this on a regular basis because we're making decisions. And it's very easy to make an improper decision because the assumptions that are in it are dated, or some of the data that's being used in it is not reconciled. So we still want to look at this on a regular basis because we become more reliant on these models. Now, as we think about beyond the periodicity of the validations, there's something that's more important, which is what is our model risk profile? If we came to a determination, well, how important is our model risk and how much risk do we have? We want to consider tier 1 models as having a greater weight. So when developing metrics to make a determination, I want to be able to go to the board or management on a regular basis and say, our model risk profile is X. It is moderate, it's high, it's low. I need to be able to create a set of metrics that the board or the management can make decisions from. My experience has largely been from big organizations. I spend time JP Morgan Chase, HSBC, Royal Bank of Scotland. So my time has largely been spent with large organizations. The methods that are used in the larger organization are very heady as it relates to model validation. It tends to be intensely academic. So I can say without question the face-off that occurs between a validator and a model developer, which also tends to be within the organization, is intense. It is not unlike presenting a dissertation. They go at it pretty harshly. And if we pause for a second and ask the question, what is the intent of model risk? Big picture, what is the intent? The intent, particularly as it relates to the management, is what is our profile and what can we do about it? We have 5 minutes. We cannot understand the subtle nuances that would otherwise be understood in a 3-month validation or a 6 to 12-month model development period. You need to be able to channel all of that information and make some type of conclusion and recommendation to management. And those recommendations include things like, should we use this? What do we do if there is deficiencies? How do we understand those deficiencies? How do we talk about the deployment and the limitations of that model? So what is equally important in a model risk program, beyond simply conducting the validation, is to be able to synthesize information in a manner that your management can take true action on and not simply be the loudest academic voice in the room, which does not lead to good decisions. You need to make it very understandable to them. Now, getting back to the original point, which is, okay, so how do we break this down for management? Well, let's give them a profile. And the profile means what? Well, in my view, let's look at ratings of a model. Ratings are not something that should be put in front of management to be debated. This is an art. There's an art and there's a science to this. It should not be confused with an audit, right? So given the art, if something is not clear, if something has not been tested appropriately, if it does not seem to be a demonstration of a full exhaustive effort into the final decisions that were made to build that model, that is the validator's best opinion. Now, there's a management within model risk to make certain that we are internally consistent in the approaches across all of our models, but ultimately we have a set of ratings for each of the models. It's a pass, whether it be with high conditions, low conditions. It's a fail. We have ratings. Those ratings can come with a scale, a point scale. Every bank can make a decision how they want to create the point scale. It's very clear. a bad score from all of the aggregate level of number of models can give you a sense of our profile. Second is, well, what about models that are in production that have not been validated? If we have models that are unvalidated, that we should make the assumption that that presents itself as a very high model risk. Now, that's not to say that those models are not working, but there's a high degree of uncertainty. And finally, I would look at issues. If we have issues that stem from a validation, we need to make certain that the model community is actively working on the remediation of these. Models tend to break down over time as a general rule. So that means models can need care over time. They need secondary reviews. And I'll just, if I can offer a piece of anecdote for a second. I used to write demographic books years ago, and I used to have a series of models. And my publisher came to me and said, I'm going to give you a proofreader that's going to look through your numbers. And I initially said, I don't need that. I know my numbers. I'm very confident in my numbers. And his comment to me was, when you review your own work, you look that everything you did was correct. When someone else looks at your work, they're trying to find something that you did wrong. And that to me is kind of a fundamental, natural condition that needs to exist between model risk and developers. We need to continue to challenge one another, because we can all be lulled into thinking that the way I did this was right because I've done this before. And a model validation is supposed to come in and say, but maybe you didn't think about something else. And that's uncomfortable to hear that sometimes, but it's necessary for that to happen. So to get back to my, get off my anecdote for a second, the point is to look, in my opinion, a low number of measures, combine these in a thoughtful way to create an index. Now, what does that index mean? It doesn't mean anything insofar as a unit of an index equals X number of dollars that could be potentially lost. We will never be able to create that. But what it does do is it presents management with the capability of understanding our model risk is either increasing, it's decreasing, or it's flat. If it is increasing, we then have a greater ability, they have a greater ability to say, why? Who? What are we not doing? Management needs to be able to have a throttle to say, I want to pick up a phone and get a hold of that developer and say, why aren't you building models that are passing? Why aren't you getting these issues remediated? Or why are you not getting your models into validation on time? It gives them an ability to be able to say, I can push to make certain that our model risk is at the level that we want it to. And it does not need to be zero. It is not prudent to think that we want a zero level of model risk. That in of itself is kind of a circular argument. You can never get there because it's a model. So we look at this and saying, it is entirely possible to accept a higher level of model risk because ultimately there's a business to be had. Right. And there are models that we might want to have in production without a validation until we can achieve that can help the business, whether it be fraud or other types of management decisions that we need to make immediately. So though my larger point really is from a perspective of how do we use measurement for management, my suggestion is to have an approach that uses and allows us to get to a profile. And in order to get to that profile, use metrics that are easily understood, that have aggregatable properties to them, such that it allows management to understand how the profile is moving and why that's happening, so some action can be taken from them. There's nothing worse, in my view, of having validators and developers come into management and argue their case. Because ultimately, when it comes into the model space, both sides will then go down into their own sides, into the most complex of modeling language, until management's heads are collectively spinning. The corona circles, and we're left with who is able to be more convincing with their argument, but it's very, very, very difficult. So keep it clean, keep it simple, and that makes it very easy for management, for regulators to understand how you are making decisions.
And I really love how you touched on the aspect of building more than just a model inventory and a model validation practice, but incorporating that culture within the bank that kind of transcends more than just the second line and talking to audit and the CRO, but making sure that it's felt throughout in the first line as well. I think that's really critical.
So there's a series of questions, even when we look for folks that are in model validation, while the background is necessary to understand models and there's a certain terminology, what is ultimately necessary not only for a validator, but something that we want to continue to reinforce throughout our model risk community is the concept of challenge. It's a concept of this is the assumption that we use, or this is the approach or the method that we're using. Mm-hmm. What we want people to do, not only from a validator, but from a user perspective or a model owner, is to ask the questions: why? How do I know that? What's changing? And oftentimes we don't want to lock the door. We don't want to worry about external influence. We want to think that we're buying a model. It's the gold standard, and it's coming from this very reputable company. So that in of itself should be enough. And what I'm trying to say today is, no, it is very healthy, not only for yourselves, but it's also healthy for external folks, and internal folks too, is to continue to ask the question. It's the pursuit of the discovery. It's not if we engage in a validation in a healthy, constructive manner, and I think that's key for a good model risk department. It's the manner in which we engage. If we go about it in a way that you are wrong and I am right, we will have not a very good outcome. If we go about it in a manner that I am independent, I am the little voice on your shoulder to say you might have thought about something a little bit different, and whispering that in your ear, it allows for a better engagement with model risk. What we like to say is we are not the gotcha department. We are not out there to try to find something wrong. We are out there from an independent perspective to be certain not only that we are meeting with the regulatory standards, but we work for the same institution. And as we work for the same institution, we want to make certain that we are making as good decisions as possible. And if we recognize that we're humans and we're infallible, then can we please recognize that I can make a mistake, you can make a mistake, and if we're if we're professional about this and we ask questions of one another in a manner that is intended to be thought-provoking and honest, then that ultimately leads to a very vibrant model risk, and it's very good for the institution, because it forces us to get our creative juices together. Like, actually, we are comfortable with the way we're doing it, and here's why. That's a success.
I couldn't have said it better. And this is really a good place to change tracks a little bit, because I think it brings us around to the reason for why the MRMIA organization exists, right? Is to kind of build forth these standards to help model risk managers ask those right questions. So Tom, as a sitting board member on in MRMIA, what is MRMIA? International Association.
Yeah, so MRMIA is dedicated to further the discipline of model risk management. There are other organizations that get together, and they will talk about their practice, and they'll talk about what are regulators looking at. But what I like that MRMIA is trying to do is present to our various model risk communities what we should and what we could be thinking about to further the discipline. We have, as I talked about earlier, oftentimes this SR 11.7 is looked at as a checklist, and the presence of an inventory, a tiering system of reporting, of validations, in of itself does not truly promote model risk in a vigorous fashion. Further is, as it relates to smaller institutions, the language that's inserted in 11.7 discusses, I'll say this in quotes, size and complexity. So the application of 11.7 should be fit to the size and complexity of your organization. Now, that's a fairly nebulous set of words. What does that mean? How complex is our organization? And what is our size? And what does that mean in terms of the way we conduct our validations? So MRMIA has asked myself to assemble a working group to develop a white paper on right sizing the SR 11.7 for smaller institutions. And what we intend to do in this white paper is to provide a set of recommended practices for our institution. The manner in which we engage with vendors, or the way we identify models in the bank, the way we conduct validations, we should be able to draw upon our collective experiences to say, given that we are a smaller size than a $2 trillion institution, we should be able to both conduct ourselves in a model risk space, put hand on heart and say, we are truly adhering to 11.7, but more importantly, we are trying to, how do we institute the concepts of model risk into a bank that leads to a culture that we are all actively challenging ourselves, each other, in the way that we develop models in the institution. That's the set of principles that we're trying to present in this white paper across the various different areas of 11.7. Again, whether it be in how do I identify models, how do we deal with vendors, how do we conduct validations, how do we conduct validations with third parties. These are prickly little subjects that we wrestle with in smaller institutions that we don't have a force of 100 validators to descend upon a bank. Quite frankly, if I had the same validators we had in a larger institution, those folks would probably fail every single model in the bank. It's not to say that these models deserve a pass because they're graded on the curve. No, we have to approach this very differently. How we train users to become owners, and how we conduct business with third-party validators, and how we need to comb the bank for models that, because we don't have developers, we have users. So the way we go about our business must be different. It should be different. And we'd like to elevate that. And if we can have a commonly shared practice, not to say that is the only way to do it, but this is, as a group, this is the way we're trying to conduct business. And I think I believe this to be something that the regulators themselves would encourage us to do. We are trying to be thoughtful about what does this mean to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is just really shines bright as what the true vision of MRMIA is, and the MRMIA group, and what you, Peter, Joe Breeden, and Alan Forrest are really doing to try and set forth common standards that other folks can follow, and just give them those kind of guide rails to make it a lot easier for them and guide them through that process. So with that said, I'm going to bring this to a close. Thank you, Toms. Thank you so much for joining us today on another session. And the listeners out there, we hope to see you again next time.
Very good. Thank you, Mark.